In this video I am going to discuss the concept of pins in chess, and I'm going to start with the board position that is shown here in the video. A pin technically is where a piece, think of it as a piece doesn't really want to move because something is hidden kind of behind it that's more important in a way. And so the bishop on g4 currently has the knight, this knight here on f3. It's said that the knight is pinned to the queen, because if you look at the bishop on g4, the bishop on g4 has this diagonal attack bearing down on the queen. And so as the white pieces, I don't want to move my knight, because if I move my knight, behind that knight is a more important piece, which is the queen. And I don't want to lose my queen for that bishop, so it is said that my knight is pinned. Pinned meaning it doesn't want to move. I really can't say that it can't move, because it can, but really bad things are going to happen if I do move it in this case. So just keep in mind that a pin is where a piece is, it's set pinned to the board. It doesn't want to move. It's stuck there because bad things will happen behind it if it moves. And so that's the general idea of a pin. So I'm going to walk through a couple of other situations on a board or in game scenarios that sometimes people run into, or I've seen that students have made, or mistakes that people have made. And so in this board position I have a current pin, and I'm not saying that you should always be pinning the knights with the bishops, because that's just my first two examples, but here is slightly different, because the knight on c6, I'm going to kind of red mark it because it's kind of immobile, and in this case that knight actually cannot move. In the last case the knight could move, but we lose the queen. In this case the knight cannot move. It would be illegal because behind the knight is the king. So in this case the knight is pinned to the king, and this bishop is pinning it. Now that's another pin. Now as the black pieces, I need to be able to see that. I need to understand that there's a problem there. I can't move the knight. I can defend it if I'd like. There would be different ways to defend it if I'd like. I could move a bishop here. I can move bishop to d7 so that I unpin my knight. I free it up a little bit so it could move. And if the white bishop took my knight, I could take back with my bishop. That would be an option. I could defend with my queen if I choose to, either by moving it to the d7 square. However, that could create other issues. Or I could move it forward to the d6 square, or I guess I could even move it forward to the d5 square if I'm thinking of defending that knight. Now that queen wouldn't really unpin anything unless I put it on the d7 square, but that could create issues. If I do move, if as white I choose to move the queen to the d7 square, I need to understand that I actually have made, I can't say I made a grave mistake, but this isn't really something I probably want to find myself in, because what I've done is I've created a new pin. I've created a new pin. Now that knight is pinned to my queen, and the knight really can't move still, because if I move that knight I'm going to lose my queen. And so pins can be very powerful in chess. I want to look for them and be careful and watch out for them. Now let's just let's say that knight, or let's say that queen does not move to where I just placed it. Let's say that the black pieces, they don't see the pin, and they think, okay, I'm going to move a different piece here. And so black decides to play bishop to g7. They move their bishop to g7 here. Now, well, they've created a situation here where they haven't really dealt with the pin, and here's an added power to pins. If I can attack that knight again with a second piece, then chances are I may gain an advantage here. And black has overlooked the fact that white could play pawn to d5. Now look at what that does. Pawn to d5 is actually, it looks like a really cool move here for white, in the sense that it's important to note that that knight can't move. That knight is stuck. It's pinned. The knight's pinned to the king. bishop's attacking. And this pawn move, this pawn to d5, adds another attacker onto that. And so the knight can't move, and it's under attack by my pawn. I'd love to take that knight with my pawn. And so now black has a problem that they have to deal with. And maybe they do defend with their bishop. But guess what? I would take that knight with my pawn, and I've just gained a knight for my pawn, even if they take here. Now there are other issues I have to be careful of in this situation. The new knight move, that black knight, the dark knight, is attacking that pawn down there. So I might just decide as white to trade this off, and I have now gained a knight for my pawn. And so we kind of have to watch and be a little bit careful here. I'll back up. And the dangers of a pin if you're not very careful, because I was able to just attack that knight with a pawn and I could win it because it was pinned. So pins are powerful. It can be powerful. You want to watch for them at different times in a game. Now, I have another position here that black has really found themselves in a mess. And there are a lot of pins on the board here. A couple of pins. The bishop on b5 has a pin happening right now. See if you can see that. The bishop on b5 has the rook pinned to the king. So that rook cannot move. That rook has been immobilized. It cannot move at all. Likewise, the bishop on g5. The bishop on g5 has a pin. It's pinned the knight to the queen, so that knight cannot move. Now, as the black pieces, that knight was actually kind of defending the rook over there. The problem is the knight can't really defend the rook technically, because if it does move over in that direction or take something where the rook was, well, then they're going to lose their queen because their knight's kind of pinned there. It doesn't want to move or they lose their queen. So in this scenario, black's found a lot of their pieces kind of all tied up. They can't move their rook. This rook can't move. That would be illegal because you can't allow the check here. And this knight really can't move. I mean, it can, but they don't want it to move because if they move it, they're going to lose their queen. So they've got some pieces that really have been rendered, I can't say useless, but they got some issues. Let's put it that way. The queen could move, but so white's got these pins happening. That's kind of immobilized black's pieces. Now white also has a really interesting move here with their queen. I'd be looking at a queen check all the way down here in the corner, which could create some pretty interesting scenarios. The only way that black could stop that check is to block it with their queen. Because remember, if I do, and I'll move this queen down here just to show because there's a lot of arrows on the board. That check, that queen is now checking or attacking the king. Well, that's a pretty strong move thinking about what's going on here, because realize that the rook cannot block the check because it's pinned right now. It's stuck. It can't move. The king, there's no way for the king to move out of check. The king only has two squares that are possible there, and it can't go there because it's still being attacked by the queen. And to the d8 square, but it can't go there because it's being attacked by the queen still. So black only has one escape out of that check, and that would be to block the check with their queen here. And now white should win this game. They're just going to trade off some pieces here. They could trade down and win this game if they just trade off pieces because they're ahead here, and the king takes back because the rook couldn't. Maybe the bishop takes the check here, and now, I mean, that would be an option. Otherwise, if they want to win the rook right away, they could win the rook here. And the beauty of this is, guess what? The bishop now has the knight pinned to the king, so the knight can't take back. So the king will take. And now, depending on how they want to handle this, if I were white, I'd probably trade these pieces off. And I still have a rook here in charge of the board. And this should be a winnable game for white. I have one last position that I want to look at, and this one is really interesting in my mind. Now, black is thinking, I could win this game. Black is looking at one move. If it was black's move and they could just do whatever they wanted to, they actually have a checkmate on the board with one move. And the checkmate would be if they could take their knight on d3, and if they could move it to f2, that's checkmate. It's actually a really cool checkmate. The knight getting to f2 is there's no white piece attacking f2, and at the same time, it would be checking the king, who is stuck in the corner and has nowhere to go. There's nothing they could do. Now, that's all fine and that's pretty cool, but guess what? Knight cannot make that move. The knight cannot make that move because it's pinned. It's pinned in two ways. Now let's look at the first way. It's actually pinned to the queen here by the bishop. And I'll be honest with you, if that was the only pin, if I was the black pieces, I wouldn't care if I lost my queen because I would win the game. And in fact, I would not lose my queen because the check would be checkmate and the game would be over and white could not even take my queen. So there's that pin. That is a pin going on. There's another pin for white by the other bishop, actually, and this isn't really part of why black can't win, but there's another pin here. There's a knight being pinned to the king there. That knight cannot move. That would be illegal. But the biggest issue for black right now is that the white queen on d1. The white queen on d1 actually has that knight pinned completely. So this knight sitting here on the d3 square wants to go to the f2 square because it wants to check and checkmate the knight. That's really what it wants to do. But it can't. Okay, it can't because it's pinned. And there is hence a power of a pin in that knight is rendered useless. In fact, white should gain some pieces here. If it is white's move, they are going to gain a piece definitely because they have two attackers on that. Let me clear the board here. They have two attackers sitting here. That knight cannot move out of that attack. And so as white, I'd try to capture either with my queen or my bishop, but the really main idea is I just gained a knight, and black lost a knight. Now, if black loses their knight, they've got to decide how they're going to handle this. If they take this back, they're going to lose their queen, so I'm not thinking that's going to be the case. They would most likely move their queen out of danger here. I don't know where they're going to put it, but let's just move it out of danger. Now, they'd have to be very careful. I'm just going to make a really bad move for black to show you what happens here. Now, notice that queen formerly had a knight pinned and it was attacking. And now it's still attacking that king, but it's hidden. And this is a different concept in chess. I might as well show you right now. It's very important. In this bishop on d3, I just want to move it. I just want to move that thing out of the way so that queen is attacking that king, and that's check. And the best place to put it is right there. Bam. Because I'm looking at what's going on right here. I've got, as white, I got a check. So guess what? Black has got to deal with the check. Whatever they do, they have to deal with that check. They got to stop it. And at the same time, I've got a piece attacking the queen. So however they decide to deal with that check, I'm going to try to take their queen. Now, they could play their queen here, and the reason I'm going to put it there is so that you could realize that their idea is they're defending it here with this knight. The problem is the knight really can't move and can't defend it because the knight's pinned by this bishop again. And so if the black pieces put their queen there, I'm going to tell you, I'm just going to take that queen right now. And they can't even take me back. There's nothing they can do. And so in this game, black is just completely falling apart. They have got to move their king out of check. And by the way, when they move their king out of check, wherever they move it, I've got some other pretty good options here. I've got a queen check coming in, and they're going to have to stop that check. So they're going to have to move out of check. And guess what? I got another. I take a rook here, and now the king's got to move out of this check. Maybe they block the check. Okay, but this game, white has just kind of torn black apart. So keep those things in mind. Pin is very powerful.